All right. Yeah, like I was saying, it's about 8:30. Let's go ahead and get started. I think today should be a pretty easy day. I wanted to start by just asking how last week was. And I know we've been chit-chatting a little bit, but I mean in the sense of having, importantly, Wednesday off class, but then unexpectedly Friday off. How did that go for you guys? Fantastic. Anyone else? Did anyone not like having the time off class? So I'm going somewhere with this. Let me phrase it a different way. Did the fact that you had Tuesday off as scheduled and then had Wednesday off, did that help? Like more so, I mean, than the fact that we have these single days off interspersed throughout the schedule. Yeah, Cedar.
I definitely felt like having more like condensed time off was much more restful, like more than I thought it would. Because I had day one to like decompress, and then I had another day to do things that were like enjoyable for me.
Right. Nice. So much more restful, more than you thought it would be. Anyone else want to add to that, or say something differently? Yeah, Cynthia. Okay, sorry, I can't really see. It's dark and everyone's masked up, but I'm slowly learning names.
My big thing was I honestly do not like having these single days as breaks. I find them way too stressful because it makes me dread the rest of the week because I feel like stuff. And honestly, I couldn't even enjoy that, this class being all Wednesday because I have all sorts of other classes to do too. So I had to wake up at the same time. I still had to do the work, so I didn't find it stressful either way.
So put differently, and forgive me if I'm misinterpreting your words, but you prefer like spring breaks in the traditional sense, like a week off.
Or at least having more than just a single day.
Right. Anyone else? Yeah, Lily.
I like the days that we have off when I do in advance. I make these snow days in advance. Then I feel like I've prepped all those work and final quiz, and then I just all get canceled. So my schedule completely gets ruined. And it's like really frustrating.
Right. Anyone else? We'll wrap it up in a second. Yeah, Elizabeth.
I think this days off are like it's much preferred to have like a long week off and then you really get to rest. But if the alternative is no days off, like last semester, I think having a day off was extremely helpful. I feel much better about my life this week than I did last week and the week before.
Right, absolutely. And here's where we're going with this. And I'd like to pretend that I planned this all in advance and didn't just misread the calendar when I gave you Wednesday off. But here's what I think is really cool. Now that we have this language of potential outcomes and treatment and dosage effects, is we can start to talk about these days off from the sense of decisions in a data-driven world. And here's what I mean. What the school would have you believe, or at least trying to say, is that a day off is a single treatment, and that treatment has what we'd call a linear effect, meaning that one day off here and one day off here is the same as 2 days off here. But what we saw last week with Monday morning off and Tuesday off, and hopefully you guys got a little bit of time off because of the snow day, is that it's more than just this additive effect. And this is something we've seen in our readings already. We saw that with drinking coffee when you're pregnant, it's not just are you having 1 cup or 2 cups, but are you having 2 cups right next to each other? We saw with drinking alcohol while you're pregnant, it's not just 1 glass of wine versus 2 glasses of wine, but how quickly are you drinking them and how fast does that alcohol metabolize in your liver? So I think the broader point here is now that we have this common language of how we make decisions in a data-driven world, we can start to analyze everything in our lives. And this is going to be really important starting next week when you start to brainstorm what you want to write about for your final papers in this class. You can write about 1 day off versus a spring break off. You can write about how much coffee you want to drink in the world. And I said world, I meant morning, but same thing, I guess. And when we have these common words like our potential outcomes framework, like treatment effects, like dosage, like average treatment effects, we can start to parse apart what it is we're actually observing. Questions or comments so far? And now let's start the class sort of proper. Let's open the floor up for any questions or comments or concerns moving forward. Great. Let's catch up to where we were last week. This week's going to feel a little compressed because we don't have 2 days to talk about experiments, but hopefully we can address that in a way that doesn't feel too rushed. Today, we're just going to talk about our reading that we had for last Friday. We're talking about Bergstrom West Chapter 4 on causality. So who wants to summarize what this chapter was about for us? Remember, guys, participation is 10% of your grade. Who wants to summarize our reading? Who read the chapter? All right. So, Ray, I saw a hand. Tell me what you remember from this chapter. It doesn't have to be a full summary. We can run from there.
It was, well, the one that kind of stuck with me, I guess, was the one about the news and how they kind of have an effect because they tweak little words that changes the causality of it, I guess.
Yeah, so let's run with that, and we'll do a more in-depth summary in a second. But one of the things this chapter talked about was sort of the importance of science communication, and how when in our labs here at Sweetbriar, we might see an association, what gets reported, and as it moves on down the line from, academic article to press release to the news picking it up to you reading the news and talking about it with your friends, becomes more and more causal and stronger language. What we see, both in our readings and it has also become somewhat of a cliche, is correlation does not imply causation. And what a correlation is a linear relationship, a linear association. But what we're interested in are causal relationships. And remember, we're interested in a specific kind of causal relationship. We're interested in the effects of causes, not the causes of effects. So what do you guys think about that? What do you think about the fact that the news might be reporting causal relationships when what we're observing is just linear associations, and those aren't necessarily the same thing? And what do you think about the fact that we're pushing back against this cliche? What do you guys think? Yeah, so for anyone who didn't hear Lily's question, she asked for a quick rewording. What do you guys think about the fact that things that aren't necessarily causal are often reported as such? Yeah, Ray.
When you were talking about like it got kind of wordy. It was like smoking won't cause cancer. They weren't categorizing it as such because there was no way to tell if you have cancer, does it just get influenced by the smoking? Like, does it affect that, or does it just
Right, so one area where we might see these causal relationships or perhaps associations being reported as causal is smoking. And in fact, what we saw was sort of the opposite, where we know smoking causes cancer, but we've seen people, perhaps malicious actors like a tobacco company, underreport and misreport. Yeah, Lily.
I think it's necessary to talk about how it's kind of human nature to kind of make these connections and just immediately think A equals B. And I think a lot of the reason that it's portrayed as such is because of like clickbait culture and just like in the self-esteem of kissing, you could easily see an advertisement for an article that's like self-esteem, better self-esteem means you stay kissing more, but really they're just trying to get views for money. So it's just a really easy way to take advantage of that human nature in a way that will give them more reach and more success.
Yeah, and for anyone who didn't hear that, one of the things that might be driving this is sort of clickbait culture and really just trying to make money off all of us. What do you guys think? Yeah, Annika.
I think if we could go back to like the in the beginning we were talking about the way a company will interpret data and advertise it out to people. So we could compare this idea to that
Right. So in one sense, we need to follow the money. I think that's really interesting, and let's build on that concept of clickbait culture for a little bit, because to some extent, clickbait is kind of new. But bullshit, as the book would have you believe, is one of the oldest things in the world. So are we seeing people misinterpret associations more now because of clickbait culture? Or is this something that's been going on for longer than that? What do you guys think? Yeah, see that.
On Snapchat and other like the Snapchat articles, which I hate as a burning passion, but they are so clickbaity, and then if you actually click on it, it's generally like very, very loosely related to the title, what they're like broadcasting. And so like that, but then they can make you think that it's more connected to what they want it to be anyway. So like they can produce their own causalities.
Right, and so Snapchat stories might lead us astray there. Much like with our discussion of fake reviews online and response bias, we can also see people push back against the clickbait. We can see saved you a click websites or things that unpack some of this. What else? What do you guys think? Yeah, Elizabeth.
So I'm sure that clickbait has always been around, because I mean, like with newspaper editings and things like that, I'm sure they kind of just sensationalize things a little bit. Maybe not to the extent that we have today, because I feel just like journalistic integrity was a little bit more of a thing. But with the widespread of information that we have now, there's like no way that it's ever been as prevalent, because there's never been so much information competing with each other. So it doesn't need to be clickbait, because like you can just read it because it's there.
Right. So it sounds like we're talking about a bunch of different things. One is whether or not journalistic integrity was more of a thing. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, right? We've got yellow journalism and Hearst doing awful things throughout, the history of the newspaper. One thing might be how competitive the marketplace for media is, right? ABC didn't have to compete as much when there were only 3 networks. Lots of interesting stuff here. Ray, I want to go back to your point about smoking, because I think you started to hit on one of our sort of favorite things to fall back on, which is one of the ways that we can move from this correlation, this linear association, to a cause is whether or not there's some underlying theory. So Lily, throughout class, you've brought up, alcohol is processed in the liver. How quickly alcohol gets processed determines how quickly it gets to the fetus, if at all. That's a biological mechanism that can give some more insight into the cause and effect relationship there, if there even is one. Smoking, we have similar biological mechanisms, right? We understand that when you inhale smoke and the smoke has bits of hard metal in it, bits of arsenic in it, it can cause changes in the lungs which can lead to cancerous cells developing. This is certainly one way that we can move from a correlation, from an association, to a causal model. But what about when we don't have this underlying theory or we don't have a mechanism? What do we do there? What do you guys think? Or put differently, do we always need a mechanism?
Is that the causation, or should be self-esteem used to like romantic situations and wisdom situations? And romantic situations would just the self-confidence. Unclear what the correlation is.
Right, and for anyone who didn't hear Kaya, there was this study, this academic article published called Never Been Kissed. People who have been kissed have higher self-esteem in college. But that's an association, not a cause. And we can think about lots of different reasons behind this association. Some of them related to the biases that we've been talking about, right? So, see it earlier in class you mentioned selection bias. How might selection bias be at play in the never been kissed argument?
The range of people they talk to and where. Anything about any of those people's past history.
Right, so what type of people are willing to tell a psychologist at age, say, 17, their kissing history? People who have really high self-esteem. We also talked about other forms of bias. One of them was collider bias. That's a common effect bias. So are there any common effects of both self-esteem and kissing people when you're young? What do you guys think? Any effects? Yeah, Jackie. So excellent point. People who are in relationships, just by construct, have more access to kissing. People who are in relationships, healthy ones at least, tend to feel good about themselves. That's more of a common cause bias than a common effect bias. We didn't come up with a word for that. We'll talk about it when we do DAGs. But the word for that is confound. This is interesting because confound is one of those words that has a colloquial meaning, but also has a specific meaning in terms of data-driven decisions, right? Common cause bias. Excellent point. People who are in relationships kiss more. People who are in healthy relationships tend to feel good about themselves. It's one of the things that partnerships do. What else? What might be wrong with this study? Annika, was that a hand or a stretch? All right. Yeah, Lara. Excellent point. For anyone who didn't hear Lara, what she said was, because all these relationships are different, because everyone interprets self-esteem differently, because everyone has different experiences kissing, it can be hard to disentangle some of these factors. Now, we have a way of dealing with this that we talked about last class, right? Where we're not looking at just one person, we're looking at the average effect. But that average might be misleading, and we have a bunch of reasons why averages might be misleading. We can talk about them a little bit more in depth later, but Jackie, because you brought up the athletic example, I think it'd be fun to go back to that. So would someone remind us what's going on with this athletic example, with this height and weight thing? All right, Jackie, it falls to you. Okay, so there's a chart of athletes with height and weight and their success in some sport. I also don't remember it because we read this a week and a half ago. But height is already related to weight. It's hard to be very, very heavy if you don't have that much height. It's hard to be very, very light if you've got a lot of height, in part because of a mechanism at play, of this mechanical thing where the stuff that weighs a lot in your body, bones and muscle and fat, is attributed to how tall you are. You can't have a very heavy 3-foot-long femur if you're not a certain height. The taller you are, the more muscle mass you're going to have, just by construct, just by this mechanism. It's going to really affect how we interpret these data. Any other compelling examples from this chapter that you guys want to discuss? Yeah, Ashley.
There was this concept of like correlation doesn't sell in the press, and there was an example that used that Zillow did pertaining to birth rates and housing prices. And I thought it was interesting because this is one that he used an example that was like that he considered right. Didn't have a lot of crap in it. He said that it discussed other possibilities, but it didn't get a lot of like press.
Excellent point. So for anyone who didn't hear what I actually said, one of the compelling examples, and perhaps this is an example of people addressing data correctly, is birth rates and home prices. But there's a lot of reasons why birth rates might be associated, and associated, we'll say linearly, with home prices. Someone not well skilled in data interpretation, someone who hasn't taken Core 170, might look at these home prices and say, when housing prices are high, people can't afford a baby, they delay having babies, it's going to drive birth rates down. But you all are well trained in data interpretation now, and the book so kindly threw out a couple of examples. What else might be going on here? Yeah, Kate.
The other way around, because they stated that sometimes having a baby, the expense of a baby is about the same as buying a house, so people may choose not to get a new house and take care of the baby and raise it instead.
Right, so it could be people who want to buy expensive houses aren't people who want to have babies. What else might be going on? And you can be creative. See that?
Maybe people who are having babies already have a house, so they're not doing anything related to the housing market.
Okay. Excellent point. Anyone who didn't hear that said, maybe it's the type of people who have babies already have houses, so they're not driving housing prices. We saw a related example in the book, which is the places where housing prices are high tend to be places that we associate with high-powered careers. Places like New York, places like San Francisco. People who go there to work and to really lean into that workaholic lifestyle. People don't move to San Francisco for the purposes of having a kid. They move to San Francisco for the purposes of working at Google. Yeah.
Maybe the people who are younger don't want to settle down and have a permanent residence necessarily because they don't like change.
Okay, excellent point. So anyone who didn't hear Franny, maybe one of the things that's going on with housing prices and birth rates is people who are younger, more fertility aged, are also more mobile. Excellent point. Broadly speaking, we can see these associations and not necessarily draw a causal impact from them. So taking all these examples to mind, all the ways in which data has been appropriately interpreted and also misused, what do you guys think of this chapter? Did it resonate with you? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? What do you think? Yeah, see it.
I thought that, the differences between causality and just association was very interesting. The chapter itself, a little hard for me to get through this one. But, yes.
All right, so interesting examples, an interesting chapter, but maybe a little verbose, maybe a little technical. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think? Yeah, Rary.
I think when it was going more into depth about things I've already heard about, so like the college nursing one with like the students and the pictures and the marshmallow one, I kind of already knew a little bit of information of it, so when it got to that point, it was easier to read. So like other things, kind of like I had to go back and read.
So maybe what makes for a compelling example is familiarity with the subject matter. Maybe it's taking something we already know and either seeing it in a new light or a more in-depth light. What about the rest of you? What do you think? Yeah, Lily.
Maybe it's just that I've like read more about students and artists, but it just kind of repetitive to the other chapters a little bit. Like with a lot of the same information about that. I mean, I think it ultimately a lot of the book that does come down to correlation with causation, and I get that, but it just seems so redundant.
Yeah, Maddie? Yeah, so I found it, I wouldn't say repetitive, but what I would say is this chapter felt a little pedantic to me, right? In particular, one of the examples that we haven't gotten to yet, where they were talking about contrapositive claims. The distinction felt a little, lacking in meaning to me. A little pedantic, a little, when you were saying verbose, that might have been accurate. So what's some pushback we can make against this chapter? And when I say pushback, think about the essays that you guys are writing. Pushback on the claims they're making, not on the writing style. Right? Repetitive isn't a good critique, but what's some pushback we can make? Let's see. So let me find the section I was talking about. And I should have underlined her dog ears. Alright, I can't find the passage I was thinking about, so let's move on. What big lessons did you take away? Yes, it was pedantic, yes, it was repetitive, but there are some important things here. What can we learn from correlations? Yeah, Annika. Correlations can be interpreted differently. Riley, you have a hand. So, but we can start to see patterns. Taking your 2 points together, we learned one important lesson from this chapter, which is data collection, data-driven decisions don't stop at any one given study or any one given article or any one given Snapchat news post. So one of the things that correlations can do, even if they don't necessarily tell us a cause and effect relationship, is generate important hypotheses. And if we see enough of these correlations, if we develop enough patterns, and we collect more and more data, we can start to infer cause and effect relationships, not from any one study, but from the pattern overall. What other important lessons, what other important takeaways did you guys have from this chapter? Yeah, Elizabeth.
I think that the talking about like associations and correlations versus causations continues to kind of drag home a common theme we've had throughout a lot of our readings, that you can't always take data at face value. You have to look deeper at it and see the broader picture surrounding the collection and representation.
All right. We have to take in the broader theme. We have to take context into consideration. What else? So there was an important lesson that I took away from this chapter, which I don't think we've hinted at yet, but one of the things that I thought this chapter did really well was talk about the difference between necessary and sufficient. And this is one of those cool areas where the words that we know just from speaking the language, the words that we use colloquially mean the same thing here. So quick, let's just refresh everyone. What does it mean if something is necessary? This is not a trick. Yeah. You need it. Madison, are you going to say something different? So a condition that you need for something to be true, for there to be a cause and effect relationship. What does it mean if it's sufficient? Madison. Right. Necessary means it's needed. Sufficient means it's all that's needed. And one of the things that this chapter did well, I thought, was talk about the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. Which I think brings us to the last point I want to make today, and then maybe we can get out a little early. It is Monday morning after all. The last point that really struck me is, we say this cliche, we repeat it, it showed up way too much in this chapter, right? Correlation is not causation. But sometimes, correlation can be causation. And that's when you are making causal inferences. And there are both necessary and sufficient conditions to make causal inferences. We're going to spend the rest of the semester talking about what these conditions are. So to make a causal inference, and we'll talk about this more on Wednesday, and we'll talk about it more throughout the semester, but to make a causal inference, you need two things. One is statistical inference. One is an identification strategy. Now, I haven't defined either of those two yet. We'll do it right now, right? What an identification strategy is ruling out alternative explanations. So, Sita, you said one of the problems with the marshmallow test might be some people don't like marshmallows. If we can rule that out as an alternative explanation, maybe the marshmallow test is going to be more meaningful. That's an identification strategy. The other thing we need for causal inference is statistical inference. Statistical inference is actually beyond the scope of this class. If you want to learn more about statistical inference, you take Dr. Loftus's class. But what statistical inference is ruling out one particular alternative explanation. Random chance. So maybe it's not that someone doesn't like marshmallows, but maybe they had just, for whatever reason, eaten 60 marshmallows that morning. Just randomly, just by a haphazard chance. Sometimes you get someone who's already full. It doesn't have to be that, it can be anything, right? Any sort of random chance. If we can rule out alternative explanations, and we can rule out one specific alternative explanation, random chance, and we'll talk about these more as the semester goes on. We'll really talk about it a lot with our experimental design class on Wednesday. Then we can start to draw causal inferences. And the reason I bring this up is because chapter 4 mentions one particular way to do that. What they called a natural experiment. Who remembers what a natural experiment is? It's fine if you don't. We read this chapter a week and a half ago and it's early morning. But if anyone does, raise your hand. Yeah, Emily D.
So wasn't it where they went out to a pub and they tried to gauge how many, what was the correlation between college students and the amount of beer that they drink?
So excellent example. That wasn't actually a natural experiment. That was just data collection. And what they did, just so we're all on the same page, is ruled out alternative explanations. So what they did was say, maybe people who are ordering pitchers already intend to drink more. It's not that the pitcher is causing you to drink more. What a natural experiment is not a researcher-controlled experiment like we're going to talk about on Wednesday. What a natural experiment is when there is a policy in place. And policy doesn't have to mean governmental, but when there is something put in place that only impacts part of a population, which gives you a reasonable comparison. One of the natural experiments we might see later in this chapter is how adjacent counties might not observe daylight savings time the same way. You see this in Indiana. You see it in places in Arizona, where you have neighborhoods that are right next to each other, but maybe one is observing daylight savings time and the other isn't. So now we can start to draw a causal impact from the neighborhood that is and the neighborhood that isn't. We have reason to believe that two neighborhoods that are right next to each other are fairly similar in other ways. We have reason to believe that there's limited selection bias, right? It's not like you're choosing neighborhood A over neighborhood B because of their daylight savings policies. What this is a natural experiment that gives us treatment and control groups. And there, when we have the conditions to draw causal inference, and I see a lot of confused faces. It's fine if you're not following me all the way right now. This is just sort of a preview of the rest of the semester. When we have the conditions that allow us to draw causal inference, correlation might actually be causation in that case. All right, questions so far? Comments or concerns? All right, any final thoughts to take us home? All right, well, great job, everyone. Remember, we're doing experimental design on Wednesday. We're doing Oster Chapter 20 for Friday. Friday morning, you have an essay due. Remember the components of good essays that we talked about, and keep emailing me if you have any questions or comments.